Bonjour tout le monde, bonsoir for those of you who are in France or somewhere else. And it's a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C. A little bit cold, but very sunny. And I'm delighted that the Alliance Française of Washington is able to organize this event. This is the second one that we have in connection with an author in France. The previous one was with David Diop. So it's nice to know that now we're able to have more authors coming from all over the world to you directly via Zoom. I am very happy that today it's Harriet Welty Rochefort who will be talking about a new book, because I read her book French Toast way back when I arrived in the United States, and I must say that I still remember it fondly because it was highly entertaining, very well written, of course, and it is something that the French need to read, and the Americans as well. So she manages to bridge, to really establish a bridge between our two countries. And I must say that for somebody who has lived 49 years in France, this is for me Légion d'honneur immediately, because you have to bear the French. We had this fabulous ambassador, some of you may have known him here in DC, Gérard Haro, who was the former ambassador of France to the United States, and who every year was using the same joke and was asking, when he was presenting his best wishes to the Americans, either on the 14th of July or New Year's Eve, he was saying, like, I still don't understand how you Americans can love the French so much. So it is exactly in that tradition that I feel Harriet goes exactly like that when she wrote the books, the first 3 books that she wrote about the French and the Americans. So I highly recommend them as well if you haven't read them yet. And Maggie Mixon, the moderator, is a student at American University in Paris, and she met Harriet through her internship, and so she will be moderating today. Again, I thank all of you for supporting us in this time of COVID, and like Natasha said, please do answer your questions in the chat. I will be filtering them. If we can't manage to answer all of them, because you're quite a lot of you today, we will make sure to send them to Harriet so she can then reply to you directly. Well, I hope you enjoy the afternoon/evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much. And up to you, Maggie and Harriet.
Thank you. Well, bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for coming to see us here. My first question for Harriet actually has to do with French Toast and her 3 previous nonfiction books. For those of you who haven't read them, she really made a name writing about Franco-American differences, but with Final Transgression, it was a pretty stark turn for you, Harriet. So I'm curious about what made you decide to switch to fiction and also to such a kind of dark storyline.
Okay, before I start with your very good question, Maggie, I'd just like to thank Sarah and Natasha and Maggie, of course, as usual, for inviting me to this event. I'm delighted to be in Washington, D.C. today, even though I'm not, and to cross the ocean. And I'm very much looking forward to answering Maggie's questions and your questions as well. So we'll start with Maggie's first question, which is about the switch I made from nonfiction to fiction. It's a very good question because I have always written nonfiction. I worked as a freelance journalist for, I don't know, 30 years or 40 years or so. And so I know what it is to write nonfiction. I could do it rather easily, but I had not a clue about how to write fiction. So why indeed would I want to go from these kind of lighthearted works that I did? I don't know, did you have a slide, Maggie, or did somebody have a slide with the covers of my books just to show them? There we go.
Here are the 3 covers.
Okay, here we go. So the first book was French Toast. Some of you may have read. That was the little book that could. Nobody wanted it. Everybody hated it, as usual in the publishing world. And then all of a sudden, everybody loved it again. So that was wonderful for me. It went through several editions, and it's been around for a long time, and it's still out there. It's just that little book that just people really, really appreciated that book. And I appreciated writing it because I wrote that book when I was about 20 years in, And all of a sudden one day I sat down and I said, I speak French, my kids go to French schools, and I've just done the whole thing, but I still don't understand all these things about the French. And I just wrote down which every single thing was, and it became the book. And so that was a great project, and a lot of fun. So I won't go on about these books because you can find them online. But just to say that the latest is Joie de Vivre, the Secrets of Wining, Dining, and Romancing Like the French. And that was a fun book to write too. So how did I go from those kinds of books about the French to, as you say, a rather stark and a dark story? Well, I could have written a book about the French every single year. I could have continued in the same vein because the French fascinate me. I guess they do if I've been here for 49 years. I guess maybe it's my husband who fascinates me, but since he's French, I extend that to all the French. And I certainly could have just continued doing what I was doing, but a story presented itself to me. That's to say, it fell in my lap. And that story could only have been told in fiction. So I had to learn how to write fiction. And that was basically the answer to your question. We'll go into it a lot more from there, but that was basically it. I had a story I absolutely wanted to tell, and it could only be told through fiction.
And so your book, which takes place largely in World War II, we've obviously seen this kind of onslaught of historical fiction about World War II with female protagonists. How do you feel that yours is different compared to all the ones that we're seeing on the shelves, and what really makes it stand out?
I think mine is different because my protagonist is an ordinary woman. She's not a brave, heroic résistant, and she's not a collaborator. She's just a woman whose main goal in life is to start a family, have a baby. And she goes through the war kind of with this tunnel vision. Nothing will deflect her from her path. And so she misses a lot, of course. She's apolitical. But I just thought she was an interesting case in that she was representative, maybe, of about 80% of the population who were going about their business and not going one extreme or one way for the other. The other thing that is different about this book, I think, is that it's very French. It takes place in France. All the people are French. The places are French. There's not one British spy. There's not one person who comes from elsewhere into the picture. It's all French. I mean, except the Germans, of course. And the other thing, and probably the most original thing, is that I focus, or part of this book, the most important part of this book, takes place at the end of the war in a period that most non-French do not know about. It's a period called it was the beginning of the Epiration Sauvage, or the wild purges, when nearing the end of the war, people were seeing the tide turn and there was a lot of score settling going on. I have read a lot about this in French, but I haven't read about it in English. There are books in English, history books, but I haven't read about it in fiction. So I think that's the originality of my fiction book. Mm-hmm.
Well, I just saw somebody ask in the chat what I'm actually about to ask. They asked if this book is based on a true story. And so I want to know about the inspiration behind this amazing, very unique story.
It is absolutely based on a true story, and that is why it had to be fiction to protect the people, and also because I did not have all the facts. And as a journalist and as someone who worked a long time for Time magazine, where there were fact checkers at the time, and you had to get every single fact checked to make sure that it was right, I'm obsessed with this. And there was no way I could do that for this particular story. So I decided just to transform it into fiction. And as far as the story is concerned, I will tell you a little bit about the background of that story. As I think you know, I'm married to a Frenchman, and next week it will be 49 years that I've been married to this Frenchman. who has a lovely family, and I had wonderful in-laws. Aren't I a lucky person? Most people really don't always say that about their in-laws, but I happened to luck out. And so we were very close, and we spent a lot of time with them, and would go out on the weekends to the country. And one day I was in the country, and I went in my mother-in-law's bedroom, and I saw a picture I'd never seen before on her mantelpiece. And it was of a beautiful young woman who was in 1940s dress and had a 1940s hairstyle. And she was kind of down on her knees looking up. And I said, "Oh, who is that woman? She's so pretty." And she said, "Oh, that was my sister." And I said, "Oh, well, what happened to her?" And she said, "She died in the war." And that was the end of it. And I found it very strange. I had never heard about this sister. And my mother-in-law is not the kind of person who spoke in 2 sentences. She was from the Périgord, and she was very bavard. She was very talkative, and she always had, incredible stories that just had no end. And here she is telling me in 2 words about this woman who is her own sister I'd never heard about. And I was totally fascinated and intrigued. And being a journalist, I was curious, and I wanted to find out about this. So I asked my husband, and he said, "I don't know anything either." So time went on, and I did not ask her, because in France, when people speak to you in a certain tone of voice and about nuance, you know what you're supposed to do and not to do. And I knew I was not to ask about this anymore, so I didn't. But it didn't keep me from thinking about it. And time went on, and then it was time for the 50th wedding anniversary of my in-laws, and we were in their apartment in Paris, and I was speaking with an elderly gentleman, and all of a sudden, I didn't ask him any questions, but all of a sudden he said to me, "Oh, that was very bad business about," and he mentioned the name of his sister. And I said to myself, "This is it. I'm going to get the story. Now I'm going to get it." But at the same time, I was looking around me, and I said, "This is a rather small room. My mother-in-law is standing maybe, a meter or 2 at the most away from me. If I allow this man who is deaf and who is speaking very loudly, like deaf people sometimes do, if I allow him to tell me the story, I will ruin her wedding anniversary." And so what did I do? I changed the subject. And so I missed the opportunity to get the story once again. By that time, I said, "I'm never going to get this story," but nothing stops me when I have an idea in my head. So I said, "Okay, I'll get it another way." And so my husband and I went down to the Périgord, to the village where this took place. We interviewed the mayor of the village. We talked to people just standing in their yards. We pieced together the whole story. And it's just very interesting that it is such a taboo. All these stories that happened so long ago, still, even in this little village, the mayor, after the interview, said to me, he told us some very interesting things, but afterwards he said, "Let's just keep this little interview that we had private, if you will." And so I did know enough of the story by this point to be able to create fictional characters. I removed some of the people in the real story, and I brought in other people who weren't in this real story, but I followed kind of the main path of it. Mm-hmm.
So Philippe's family, and for those of you who don't know, Philippe is Harriet's fabulous French husband. You said Philippe's family talked a lot about the war, not about what happened to his aunt, the main character, but they did talk a lot about the Nazi occupation of Paris. So what kind of things did they speak of when they talked about the occupation? Because we as Americans can't really imagine or empathize what that must be like.
Well, I thought I might get that question. And so there are some slides that if you wanted to put them up now, I could explain maybe or tell you about some of the things that they talked about and put it in perspective. Yes, here we go. Now, some of you out there may know this famous picture over here with this man watching the German troops on parade. As you can see, he is aghast and appalled by what he's seeing, as you would be if you saw the Chinese marching down towards the Capitol in Washington, D.C. He's seeing these German troops, and it's very painful for him. He's very humiliated, as the French were. People had different reactions, of course. There were people like Séverine in the book. Her husband thought the Germans probably deserved to win because the French generals had been so bad in their strategic planning. We had all kinds of reactions, which I show in the book. We could go on to the next one. My mother-in-law spoke a lot about the queuing for food, and the French were actually very deprived. France had among the most stringent restrictions about rationing in the war in Europe. And normally you have 2,000 calories a day, they say, for a normal adult. And what the French had was about 1,200, which is, you know, about half that. And people were hungry, and they queued up for the food. And my mother-in-law, I like to tell this story about her. I was in her kitchen, me, the American, of course, who didn't live in a country that had ever been occupied. And I'm standing there peeling potatoes. You know, great chunks of the, you know, potato peelings are landing on the counter. And she looks at me and she says, "I see you've never lived through a war." And at the time I said, well, that's a typical mother-in-law comment. But later on, I understood that they had to be so careful because there was so little food. And so that was one thing. Another thing was, she told me another anecdote that I loved. We in the States don't really eat rabbit a lot, but in France they do. And my mother-in-law, who ate everything, said, you know, there's one thing I just could never eat after the war, and that was a rabbit. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, because sometimes during the war, you would get a rabbit, but actually it was a cat. So, you know, things like this. So that was her way of explaining to me the problems of the provision of food. Why? Because the Nazis took all the good food. The apartments were cold because the Nazis had the coal industry, etc. And they left the scraps for the French. So the deprivation was something that was very important. People like Séverine in my book were living in a country that had been taken over by the Germans. So they would walk down the streets and see road signs in German sometimes. They would see posters telling them how happy the family would be if only they would go to work in Germany, things like this. They also got posters from Marshal Pétain, and we'll go to the next slide for that. You who know history probably know this picture of Hitler and Marshal Pétain. Very sad moment in history. I've heard that Marshal Pétain thought that he would get better conditions for the French if he collaborated. Of course, that didn't turn out to be true at all, and it was a puppet government, and it led to terrible things. And over here on the other side is an exhibition of the Jew in France, which was, this is a true exhibition that took place at the Palais Berlitz in Paris and then circulated around the country. And it was a terrible racist exhibition about the identity of the Jew. And I don't need to tell you all the cliches and stereotypes one might find inside that exhibition. The reason I'm talking about it right here is that there's a scene in my book in which my characters are there. And you can, it's another way of showing how people reacted differently to different things. So we can go on about that. So what do you do when your country's been overrun? Do you join the maquis, the résistants? Do you join the milice over here that are with Pétain and the Germans? What do you do? It's very comfortable when you're an ocean away to say immediately, I would be a résistant. I mean, there's no question. Actually, I should have put a big diagonal line down between these photos because 80% of the population was in the middle. They didn't do one and they didn't do the other. They were kind of waiting. They might have been doing some passive resistance. They might have been denouncing, you don't know. What I'm saying is it was a very complicated situation. So it's often easy for people who are not in it. What I found interesting in this book was that I'm not judging, I'm presenting. I'm telling a story about something that happened, but I am not sitting in judgment on it. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Okay, at the end of the war, there was score settling. This is a famous photo by Robert Capa, the Hungarian photographer, in Chartres, where the beautiful cathedral is. You see the lady there with the shaven head and the baby. They're parading her through the streets. She has slept with a German. Somebody's denounced her, or it was, everybody knew it. I don't know the story. But you can see that the people are all staring at her and they're laughing and they're jeering. And it's just a frightful, shameful scene. So that is what they call the Tondu. But there was even worse than that, if you can imagine. And that was when people were just shot in acts of summary justice. That's to say, they were just taken out and shot because they were suspected of being collaborationists. And they may have been, but they also may not have been, but they didn't get a trial. So that's the basic, those are the basic kinds of things I wanted just to show. My book, thank you, Maggie. My book is not only about the war, it spans 30 years. So that's the last part of it. And it's obviously the most important part of it, but there are a lot of things that go on before that.
Well, speaking of the parts in your book that aren't about the war, at the beginning, when we see the main character, Séverine, growing up in the countryside, there's this very strong theme that carries through of class differences in France, with Séverine kind of being taken under the wing of the countess, and then her marrying a wealthy man in Paris. So in France, it seems in your book that the classes are very rigid. Would you say that is still holding up, or has that eroded a bit?
I don't know about rigidity, but I do know that France is a top-down society, because although the French cut off the head of Louis XVI, they still, in my opinion, see the president as almost a king. They're always looking up to someone to, make the decisions, etc. The liberté, égalité, fraternité, they do believe that, of course, but there are social classes. There are still aristocrats. There are the bourgeoisie, etc. And the workers, the communists, and the capitals, and the class differences, I think, are still pretty strong. And we're not going to talk about Democrats and Republicans and anything that's going on in America. I'm talking about France tonight, so we'll just take a little break from our country, from America, and stick here in France. Yes, now Séverine comes from a very humble background. She marries a wealthy man, but she's mentored by the countess of the castle. And there's a scene in here where all of a sudden 8-year-old Séverine realizes something. At her young age, she realizes something about social class. And if I may, I'll just read this excerpt right now. Just a little background, Séverine's parents are caretakers at this castle, and they are employed by the count and the countess. And the countess really, really likes Séverine and has taken her under her wing. So Séverine and her little friend Paul have been invited to tea in the castle. It's a very special occasion. Séverine, although she had accompanied her mother into some of the rooms of the castle, was not used to huge dining rooms with tapestries on the wall, enormous sideboards, a majestic dining room table with huge high-backed chairs for sumptuous or semi-formal feasts. As Paul sidled up closer and closer to Giselle, Giselle's the countess, she looked around her. She was intrigued by the silk curtains, the view of the manicured grounds from the windows. She was gratified that her mother had undoubtedly polished that table, maybe even made the savory cakes on the plate in front of her, and her father was responsible for the beautiful view. He's the gardener. At the same time, something new was happening, and it both excited and shamed her. She realized that when she grew up, she would prefer to be in the countess's place rather than in her parents' humble dwelling. Oh, the cottage was comfortable enough, and there were always good smells from the kitchen. Although tiny, her home was always neat and clean, but the plates they ate on weren't like these. Without thinking, she moved her fingers over the china saucer. It was so delicate, almost transparent. The plates in her house were thick and heavy. She looked at the silver, picked up her fork to weigh it in her hands. It was heavy as well. Then she looked at the countess with unfeigned admiration. She remembered Caroline telling her about a town just like paradise, about how there was a castle there, a beautiful and benevolent queen. She had dismissed that fantasy at the time, knowing that Caroline was trying to find a way to console her for the loss of their grandmother and reassure her about the upcoming move to Sorignac. But now, as she stared at Giselle, she realized that Caroline was right. The countess was indeed beautiful and benevolent, and Séverine had made up her mind. She wanted to be like her when she grew up. So the die is cast. 8-year-old Séverine has chosen her side.
Well, we see, Séverine, even at a young age, she has a very particular personality, as does her sister. They're pretty much what one could call polar opposites.
Yes.
Did you mean to cast them in that way, or to write them in that way in order to represent something bigger, like maybe both sides of the good and the bad in the occupation, or was it not meant to be a signal of something larger?
No, it really wasn't. I just kind of did it. I have a sister, older sister. I mean, I have the same, but older, younger sisters. My sister's older, and she's like Caroline. She's very serious and pragmatic and gets things done and is an achiever. And I'm much more like Séverine in the sense of being more hang loose, as we say. And it amused me, I think, to do the sister thing, because I know about sister thing. I think anybody who's got a sister knows about sisters. Yeah. So no, it was more of an amusement for me than trying to make some big philosophical statement about about that.
Well, when you were going after big philosophical aspects of the book, you did very extensive research. You even told us about your trips to the Périgord to kind of uncover this story that was very taboo. Could you tell us a bit about your research methods? How exactly did you go about uncovering all of this information? Because we know you were not going to get it from your mother-in-law.
Exactly. First of all, I like doing research myself. I did not have a research assistant. I did the research. I did it by choice, because when I research, then it becomes mine. So if I had an assistant, the assistant could go to a museum and show me a picture of something. It wouldn't mean anything to me. If I take the trouble to go to that museum and spend an afternoon there and look at photos of how people were dressed in the 1940s, then it becomes mine. And that's what I did for everything. So I went to that village, the village where the real event happened, and I interviewed people. I saw a man in his yard. It's a little hamlet. I mean, it's teeny tiny. And I was with my husband, and we just went up to him and we said, we asked him some questions. And he was very silent. And he asked us one question about, did we know so-and-so? And we said no. And then he disappeared, and he went back in his house, and we didn't see him again for the whole weekend. And I calculated his age, and I think he may have been involved in what happened. And then another woman came out of her house, and she knew the story. She knew the whole story. Absolutely. And so she told me the whole story. And getting this from people who had been there and who knew it was absolutely, what's the word? Surprising, very surprising, and satisfying, of course, on a certain level. So that was better than any kind of work anybody could have done for me, and I was very glad to have done that. We did interview the mayor, and I think I told you he said to keep it to ourselves what he told us, but he told us a lot of interesting things. The things I'm referring to are things about the politics, the communists and the Gauls, etc. Everything was going on there. We went to the archives in Périgord. I mean, we were very serious about it. But getting off of the war, there are many things in this book. When I describe Montparnasse and the coupole, and when I talk about the Art Deco furniture and roulement, these are all things that I researched myself. And I was just this afternoon, I was at Père Lachaise because it's a beautiful day. It was a beautiful day in Paris. And so we live near the Père Lachaise cemetery. And I was thinking about how for one scene, there is a scene where Séverine and her to-be husband go to the Père Lachaise to see the tomb of Modigliani. And I did that walk myself to go see the tomb of Modigliani. And I had as hard a time as they did finding it. So in the 1930s, I researched the political climate. As I say, you know, she's born in 1911 and story ends in 1944. So there were a lot of things to research along the way. So that's a long answer to your question, Maggie.
Well, with these wild purges, the Epiration Sauvage, I personally had never heard of it. And you say it's very rare for Americans to know about it. So why do you think they're so surprised to discover this? And for a lot of people to discover this through your book, why do you think it is something so that the French don't really bring out a lot?
Well, I mean, the Allies were there to liberate France and liberate Europe, and they weren't concerned at all with what the French were doing with their internecine fighting and, you know, the resistance, etc. They were there to do their job and to sacrifice their lives for not just the French, but, you know, for everyone fighting the Nazis. And so unless you're a student of French history or particularly interested in this, you probably wouldn't know about it. But I myself got very interested in how the French lived under the occupation. And I was very surprised myself to learn about this period of score settling and fierce resistance and fierce, well, I did say score settling, the events that were taking place. And I did, by the way, learn the person who was my model for the countess in real life wrote a book about what was going on in the southwest of France at that time, not in retrospect, but actually at the time. And so I just followed that book, and it was absolutely fascinating to have found it. It was like a, you know, a treasure house of information and context of that period.
Well, I only have 2 questions left for you, and they both kind of have to do with in the present day, what we can glean from this book. My first question is, do you think personally, you are in a French family, you have many French friends, do you personally feel that the French have recovered from the humiliation of being occupied?
I think that the generation of my in-laws didn't recover from that. They were always very aware of that. And I think that my husband, having grown up with that and having been born during the war, even though he was very tiny, I think that's remained with him as well. I think that for our children, this generation, no, it's not a concern. It's not like it was. Memories are not that long, unfortunately. So I think that's, no, I think that the French desire to be independent stems from that.
Definitely, I would agree with that. And my last question, which is normally my favorite to ask you, is what was the hardest part of writing this book, and what do you want people to really take away from it?
Okay, the hardest part, I love this question because we've talked about this before. The hardest part was guilt, sheer guilt. Why? Because I was writing about somebody, even though I didn't know the person, it was a member of my husband's family. I felt like I was betraying something, and it was very uncomfortable for me. And so for years, it took me a long time to write this because of this kind of feeling of, oh, I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing. And the years went by, and that lessened a bit. But it wasn't until I ended the book and I told my sister-in-law about it, that I'd written this book. And she said, oh, well, that's okay. That's interesting. And I said, I don't believe this. It was like Maupassant's The Pearl. You know, I spent all this time, all these years with this horrible weight on me, and it didn't have the same effect on the people who knew the people involved. So yeah, the other part, which is not so weighty, was that the characters were speaking to me in French. I told you, this is a very French book. It happens in France, and my characters, when they spoke to each other in my head, they were speaking French. So I had to get it into English. And at one point, somebody read the manuscript and said, it's kind of stiff, your dialogue. And I said, oh my goodness, there's a reason for that. And I had to work that out a little bit. So that was another thing. I'm trying to think anything else. It was all hard. It was hard to switch from nonfiction to fiction, to be in somebody's head and follow along, you know, not switch, things like that. So I think
just to show how hard this was for you, do you want to tell everyone how long it took to write this?
I don't
first
think
work of fiction?
Well, I first got the idea in 2007.
Wow.
My granddaughter was 6. So she's now what? Anyway, it's been a long time. Of course, I did write one of my other books in between, but this book was in my mind all the time. And it just took me forever for all those reasons. But I'm very, very happy that it's out now. So
I'm very happy too, and I think we all are. Thank you so much for answering my questions. Now it's time for what I see is everyone being very active in the chat. I think they want to know a lot more from you.
Okay. Are you?
Yes, so we have a few questions in the chat, and we also have some comments. So you did answer the one about the true story, but one of the question is was that to somebody who has obviously read very well your book, is said it seems the main character was caught between the own immaturity and the politics of war. Why didn't she just go to see her sister and keep her head down? Did she not see how hard it was for the people?
Séverine, yes.
Yeah.
Did she not see how hard it was for the people?
Yeah.
No, she had tunnel vision. She had tunnel.
Okay. Another question is the fictional story true enough to the real story of your husband Hound, or did your husband's family, who knows about the taboo story, recognized it, or was it different enough that they didn't not recognize it?
Oh, that's a good question. Now I have to tell you something. It took me so long to write this story that unfortunately, by the time I finished it, my in-laws had passed away. So they weren't there to see the result of it. And I never told them I was writing it. I probably spared them something that they didn't need to know anyway. But no, I don't. Yeah, well, no, it's a very good question. My mother-in-law, who grew up in this little hamlet, actually, one of the reasons I wrote about that was because my mother-in-law always told me about that. She would tell me about where they lived, because she lived in the castle, and she lived as the daughter of caretakers, and she did go to school in a little town like that. So she might have recognized that. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Melanie wants to know, as she said, she completely understands doing research on your own, and it looks like it's a joy to make discoveries at the library. What specific places did you go to find your information?
Oh, I went to many different places. I went to museums, for example, the way people were dressed in the 40s, many of Séverine's clothes. I went to a museum in Lyon for that, where they were having an exhibition. I went to a museum in Paris to learn about Art Deco and the roulement chairs, etc., furniture. Oh, I went to the town where they grew up to set the scene, and towns around there to make a composite. I went everywhere. And I read a lot of books. I read a lot of books in French and in English, both. So.
A question from Hélène Goldstein. She assumed, she thinks it's a fair assumption to say that Americans and the Allies assume that the French were at least sympathetic to the Nazi. Is it still nowadays a fair assumption? For instance, I guess related to the end of your book, she said the score settling, did it depend more on who you were? Because in the case of Coco Chanel, for instance, as mentioned by Ellen, she probably never faced score settling. So was the score settling, the wild purges at the end of the war, more linked to who you were on?
Well, there were people who weren't punished and who were very prominent people who got away with a lot. Yes. And then there were people who were in different cases who were just taken out and shot. You know, it's the complication of war is such. Here, I've got a story to tell you about. These were friends of my in-laws. The man was a prefect, a préfet, with an important position. And at the end of the war, he was taken off in a car by the résistants who were going to shoot him because he had worked for Vichy. And then they changed their minds. And so he lived. But had they taken him out to the woods to kill him, that wouldn't have been exactly a legal kind of thing to do. That's what I'm pointing out. People might have done things that were reprehensible, but it's important to have a trial for these people. And there were trials later on, but not always.
Another question on the book, is the church at Saint Eulalie real?
Is the church at Saint Eulalie? Well, if the person thinks it's real, I'm very flattered, because I went to a church that corresponded exactly to what I saw in my mind. And it was, and then I described it. So that church, is it real? Yes, I suppose you would say it's real. It's real in my mind.
It's a bit like Proust and the church at Balbec.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm flattered to be. I'm just reading Proust these days, so.
Yeah, it's a bit like Proust having this idea of the Balbec church, and you have your own.
That's exactly it. Thank you, Proust. Thank you.
It's all those years in France. You cannot escape Proust, right? So another question from Melanie, and a comment as well. She said that her grandma and mom lived in the United States through the Great Depression, and had obviously they knew food shortages. She says her grandmother was keeping chicken in a closet in Chicago and bartered them for absolutely everything. Although it was not like what the French lived through the occupation, but there were food shortages. So a very interesting question. Do you think that the French turned to the art of food and eating because of the terrible time?
Well, I'll speak specifically about in my mother-in-law's generation, because this is what I know about and what I saw, is that they appreciate food a lot more. You know, when you haven't had it, you appreciate it more when you do. And that that may be something that remains, certainly, to have been deprived and then to finally go back to normal. So, yes.
Yeah. Question about translating the book. Are there any plans to translate the book in French? And that's a question from Paul Gavora. And then Sawyer Graham Stewart is asking if you are working on another book.
Right. Translation. I would love to get it translated. I hadn't really thought about it too much, but it's not a bad idea. I think a lot of French people would enjoy that, including my sister-in-law. And am I working on a new book? I'm very frustrated because I want to be working on a new book. And I'm in this period where I'm looking around for ideas and waiting for one to hit me the way that the idea for this book hit me. And of course, that's kind of unusual, but we'll see. Yes, I would love to work on a new book.
About the French communists and the Russian communists, how much do we know about the relationship? Because you mentioned the communists when you talked.
Oh, about the French and the Russian communists. Well, in the beginning of the war, the French Communist Party was leaked to the Soviets. And the French communists didn't do much in the way of resisting in the beginning of the war until the German-Soviet pact was dissolved. So after that, the resistance in France became very, very active and in the war, and were very active resistors, but not in the beginning.
Right. Melanie made the last comment about that her mom, who had gone through food shortages during the Great Depression, became a gourmet cook and invented a dessert, and that she spoke of her hunger and eating chicken foot soup. So there's still consequences of that. I think I have asked.
I think what is the question of Dawn? Did we ask that one? How much does the occupation resonate with people under the age of 50?
Oh, yeah.
And what do parents tell their children about the occupation?
Yeah, thanks,
That's
Natasha.
what Dawn asked.
Under the age of 50? That's a good question. It's very good question, because I base everything I know about the occupation on what I heard from my in-laws. And my husband bases everything that he knows about the war. Well, my husband is a historian also, but everything he knows from all the stories about the war that everybody tells. There's this idea in the States that the French never talk about the war. I don't know where that comes from. I think it comes from the fact that there wasn't enough published in English about the war. But from my research, I saw a lot of things published about the war, about the purges, about all kinds of subjects that people seem to think haven't been discussed. So that's one thing I learned. The generation living through the war, of course, they saw cities bombed and destruction and all kinds of terrible things, even cities bombed by the Allies. And I gotta hand it to the French. That's one thing I never, in 49 years, only once did I ever hear one French person say something about, yes, that city was destroyed by American or English pilots. But Saint-Nazaire was totally wiped out, and Le Havre and Caen and all these places were bombed. It was a terrible time. So.
Natasha is asking a question. What is your favorite character in the book?
Oh, Natasha, what a question. Well, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised, but I liked Séverine. I know that she didn't act the way that she should have, but Séverine was Séverine. She was entière. She was who she was, did the best she could. And I liked her spunk, especially when she was little. And I just was attracted to her, the way the countess was. And I think that's why she interested me a lot, more than her sister Caroline, who was a very good person. But Séverine interested me with her personality.
Comments that are very interesting. One from Annie, who says that she heard a lot about the war from her grandparents and the mother, and how they lived through food shortage, including bicycling to a family farm in Normandy to get fresh eggs and butter, trying not to be caught on the way back, and that her grandparents talked freely about it all. Same for me. My grandparents talked about the war. Yes. Every Sunday at lunchtime.
Okay, well, that's exactly it. Yes.
I was born in 1962, less than 20 years after the end of the war. So probably the reason why I wrote my thesis on war and cinema comes from having been fed every Sunday lunch with World War II.
Well, there you go. Yes. Well, that was basically the way in my husband's family too, all the stories about World War II.
Yeah. It's a very, very interesting question. Dory is asking whether anyone is interested in making a movie about your book. And I will piggyback on that one, and I will ask you, if there were a movie to be made about your book, who would you cast? And then we'll end up with that very interesting question.
Okay, well, I should have been ready for this question, but I would no, I think there might be some interest, but I couldn't talk about that. But as far as who would I cast, I'm going to disappoint you, because I've been casting around myself about that, because I just, to me, this would be a movie that would be made in French more than in English, or, and so I'm looking around for French actors, actresses, and I just haven't found the people yet.
Well, Harriet, this was a real pleasure for a Saturday afternoon in DC. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion. If you haven't read the book, please do so. It is totally a page turner. You cannot put it down, absolutely cannot put it down. It's fascinating, for a read, and I won't tell you more because I want everybody to read it. But please do so, because it's really a good book. It's available. It was available still a few days ago again at Politics and Prose in DC. And I think Harriet was actually, you did something at Politics and Prose with a class on the book. So it's a book that will probably be quite known in the United States, and I hope it has a long shelf life everywhere and that everybody buys it.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you so much for inviting me.